And that's more like, so that's a bit of an institutional change and a professional change, but I also think individually we need to engage in this anti-racist work. And I'm going to quote Ibram X. Kendi because his book was amazing and I loved it so much. And he said that something that really was uncomfortable for me and I had to sit with for a really long time was that if we are not actively being anti-racist, then we're racist. And you cannot claim to be not racist, particularly in the language I hear a lot of being colorblind, because that is not enough. And that is not what anti-racism is. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say about what this work means to them.
Thank you, Ashley. Now on to Norda.
Okay, so this is a really great question, and I have a lot to say, but I first want to say that anti-racist work means moving away from the conventional, what I call status quo DEI model. So I have to confess that I've been a proponent of diversity initiatives in libraries, and there's nothing wrong with them per se, but my views have evolved over time. So I think we're all familiar with maybe the status quo DEI model. This looks at the what I term the diversity problem as being about, we focus on the lack of representation of BIPOC or other people, diverse librarians and library workers in the library. And often the work focus on if we hire enough of these diverse librarians, we will solve the diversity problem. So my views on that have evolved over time. And so I recognize that just hiring diverse librarians, it doesn't solve the problem. I feel that I call the conventional status quo diversity, equity, inclusion work. This is performative. I feel like sometimes it's a checkbox kind of, you know, okay, we hired, so check. We hired an Indigenous librarian. We've hired a Black librarian, check, check, check. We're diverse. And so for me, anti-racist work means first recognizing that we live in a racist society that's dominated by whiteness, by white supremacy, and systemic oppression exists. And so just like Ashley, I love Dr. Kendi's, Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think it's important to have a shared definition of what racism is. He defines racism as a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. And so racism is any ideas or that suggest that one racial group is superior or inferior to another. So I also agree with Ashley, like libraries are not neutral, and that's the typical status quo DI model does not acknowledge that racism exists. And when we enter the library, it's not that racism just disappears. So for me, recognizing that there are systems and policies that lead to racial inequity. In the case of academic libraries, it could be includes the larger library or university or college that the libraries are a part of. And so if we don't, we will replicate and reproduce these ideas and policies and systems if we don't actively work to recognize them and dismantle or change them. So, I think that anti-racist approach to my work is asking those questions. What are the policies? What are the programs? What are the practices that are causing or reproducing those racial inequities in the library and in the LIS field in general? So an anti-racist approach would examine those structures in place that privileges whiteness throughout all the different systems, from collection development to teaching to who's in charge, and who has the real power. But yeah, so I have to say that that I have evolved, and anti-racism means calling out and working on those policies and systems.
Thank you, Norda. Now on to David. I don't think you're,
now I'm unmuted. I just got to remember to do that every time. Hold up. Okay, well, I think I'm going to echo some of, what's been said already, but I do hesitate a little bit around the process of sort of defining what is and isn't anti-racism. And I think it's because I think it's so important that we focus on recognizing the existence of anti-racisms in the plural, the existence of sort of different stories about racism as a problem and different stories about what challenging it looks like. And I think it's even more important still to recognize the interests that are served by each of those different kinds of versions of anti-racism. Right, so doing that kind of thinking can help us be more attentive to where we direct our efforts and who we decide to work with. Having said that, if I take the question to be about the kind of anti-racism work that I'm interested in, the kind of sort of most meaningful to me, I would say it's the kind of anti-racism work that centers a structural analysis. And let me put a finer point on what I mean by structural. Since we're just a few months past the summer during which everyone from academic libraries to Amazon to arms manufacturers, everybody was indicating this interest in Black freedom, and phrases like systemic racism and structural racism were being thrown around and more or less revealed to mean whatever those speaking them wanted them to mean. So when I say that the anti-racism that's meaningful to me is one that centers a structural analysis, I'm not just referring to the idea of racism as system-wide or as widespread or as long-standing. Obviously, it is those things, but this past summer, we saw people like George W. Bush and organizations like Chase Bank talking about racism as system-wide and long-standing. And so what I'm referring rather is an anti-racism that actively seeks to name and confront racial capitalism, which is to say, in a word, capitalism, which is to recognize that the racially animated violence that seems to be on everyone's lips these days and has been since the summer is a central and sustaining feature of the political and economic structure of our society. So when I say structural analysis, I'm not just talking, in other words, sort of about diversifying capitalism or including more people in its institutions or making relations within it more racially equitable, or even as Kendi suggests, even just simply changing policy within that, which isn't necessarily a threat to the political economic structure. So that's sort of one of the key things that makes an anti-racism meaningful to me. Beyond this, I'm interested in anti-racism work that's attentive to how it's situated in relation to institutional structures. And I think this part relates really directly to academic libraries, to LIS and to academia. So the BCALS statement, I don't know if you call it BCALS or BCALS, but I'm going to call it BCALS because it's easier. The BCALS statement suggests that academic libraries and academia more broadly are embedded in structures of white supremacy and settler colonialism. And I think if we recognize this, then we do well to kind of pay direct attention to the histories and the dynamics by which the incorporation of anti-racism into those institutions, right? The incorporation of anti-racism into our institutions has more or less worked to neutralize more radical anti-racist threats to structural racism. So it's not just that institutional forms of anti-racism are limited or are not enough, but I think they can be a central part of the problem because they often and really easily end up working in service of racial capitalism rather than actually against it. Right? Relatedly, I'd say that those of us working in academic libraries, LIS and academia more broadly, I think we need to step away from and guard against a tendency to define our anti-racism work as about fixing the place that we are, right? To sort of guard against this ingrained tendency to think about anti-racism as, for example, about making academic libraries better or less racist. Right? So I think we'd do better to think about our anti-racist work as outward facing, as working from within our profession, rather than just in our profession. It's sort of from within our profession rather than just in our profession. And in practical terms, what I think that means is that it has to be an anti-racism of relationship. And by this, I think, by that I mean that it has to be an anti-racism predicated on actively situating ourselves as part of larger struggles and on making connections with other sites of such struggles, which in turn means being in community with grassroots struggles beyond the confines of our institutions. So not always thinking of ourselves as representatives of institutions, but thinking of ourselves as part of broader struggles and acting in that way. Finally, I'd say that I'm interested in anti-racisms that reject the immediate need for practical institutional outcomes, which is a sort of central part of our field. And so, you know, for a long time, I was kind of afraid of saying that publicly, but it's the truth. You know, I'm interested in in anti-racism that recognizes the need for intellectual work, whatever form that might take. So I don't just mean scholarly, I mean intellectual work, right? So it takes a bunch of different forms inside, outside the academy, right? An anti-racism that can undertake the kind of messy and open-ended practices that I think are required to make sense of the complex workings of racism, of racial capitalism, and to sort of to imagine what a future might look like absent those structures of violence, right? And I don't think you get there immediately and singularly by focusing on only and centrally on practical institutional outcomes, because that leaves no space for doing the imaginative work beyond those existing institutional arrangements. So, you know, that's some of the things I think about when I think about what kind of anti-racism is meaningful to me. What is that I'm the most interested in? Do I recognize that people are doing a bunch of different kinds of work that may be complementary?
Thank you, David. Now on to Maha on this question.
One of the perks of being the last person on the panel is that everybody has said a lot of things that you want to say. But I will talk about my prepared work. So anti-racism to me means being proactive, being intentional in our work. It usually means imbalance of something, usually often power. It means transformation is needed in what we are doing. We have a symbiotic relationship with our institutions as academic libraries. So we cannot just change things ourselves to make changes happen in academia. I'm also very aware as a PhD student that as one person, I'm not going to change the world in terms of EDI. I'm even not going to be able to change my own library. I can only focus on what I do towards EDI to bring some awareness to EDI in librarianship. So we have to move beyond talking about collections, talking about services, talking about a tool guide, like a research guide with resources. But we also have to talk about, because the Western civilization is built on having documents and following documentation, we do need those documents. We need policymaking. We need HR practices right down towards services. So, but again, policymaking is one thing, and instituting what you have in your policy is another thing. So leaders have to make sure that they walk the walk and they walk the talk, and they set pathways for others to follow these practices every day. I recently read Engaging in the 6 Cultures of Academia, and suddenly understood, and it was not a shock, but suddenly really understood why it is so difficult for academic institutions to change. Because if we only have these 6 cultures and EDI is not part of the culture, EDI is not interwoven into these 6 cultures, then of course we have a problem on our hands. So I hope somebody rewrites this book and talks about EDI as another culture, or EDI as an interwoven culture into all of these things. So like my other panel speakers, I also agree that librarianship is not neutral. Academia is not neutral. This is not a safe space. We talk about diversity and inclusion and equity and always mean different things from our own perspectives, and we bring different things to the table. So I think we need to have an epistemically different approach to anti-racism or EDI conversations in academia, and we need to together figure out what that epistemically different approach would be to EDI in academia or libraries.